For 19 years, I've carried a weight that has nothing to do with grief. My name is Antonia Salzano, and I'm the mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis, the teenager who died of leukemia on October 12, 2006, at just 15 years old, and who was beatified on October 10, 2020, in Assisi. What I'm about to share isn't another story about Carlo's devotion to the Eucharist or his digital cataloging of Eucharistic miracles. This is about a 40-minute conversation that took place on the evening of August 12th, 2006, approximately 2 months before his death, when my son explained to me a theological truth so profound, so pastorally urgent, and so specifically relevant to the year 2026 that I've kept the complete details private until now. Carlo told me a secret about Purgatory that could liberate millions of souls during the upcoming Jubilee year, but only if Catholics worldwide understand 3 specific errors that invalidate most of the indulgences they believe they're gaining. I was 40 years old when Carlo died, and in the 19 years since his death and subsequent beatification, I've become someone I never imagined I would be. Before Carlo's illness, I was simply a mother living in Milan, married to Andrea Acutis, focused on raising our son in the Catholic faith he embraced with such extraordinary fervor from age 7 onward. I wasn't a theologian. I wasn't a spiritual director. I was just a woman who went to daily mass because my son's devotion to the Eucharist had gradually transformed my own spiritual life from lukewarm practice to genuine encounter. But after Carlo's death, and especially after his beatification in 2020, my life changed completely. Suddenly, I was being invited to conferences worldwide to speak about Carlo's life. Pilgrims would come to our home in Milan wanting to pray where Carlo had prayed. Journalists would ask me questions about his mystical experiences, his relationship with Mary, his understanding of salvation and sin and heaven. I've given hundreds of interviews, written books, participated in documentaries. I've shared so much about Carlo's spiritual life that sometimes I feel I've turned our family's most intimate moments into public property. And yet, through all of this, I held back one conversation. The most important conversation Carlo and I ever had about theology, the conversation that I now realize was not meant for the immediate years after his death, but for this precise moment in 2025, as the Church prepares for the Jubilee year of 2026 that Pope Francis has convoked under the theme, Pilgrims of Hope. My daily routine now involves answering emails from people around the world who write to me about answered prayers through Carlo's intercession, about conversions that occurred after reading about his life, about young people who discovered their vocations after learning about Carlo's radical commitment to Christ. I maintain Carlo's website, documenting Eucharistic miracles. I work with the postulator for his canonization cause, organizing documentation of miracles attributed to his intercession. I travel frequently to give talks, always staying in simple accommodations because Carlo taught me that true wealth is measured in grace, not comfort. But through all these activities, I've lived with a growing urgency, a sense that there was something specific I was supposed to do before the Jubilee year 2026, something Carlo had explicitly asked of me during that August evening in 2006. And that the time to fulfill that mission was approaching rapidly. The crisis I've carried isn't grief over Carlo's death, though of course I miss him every single day. The crisis is more complicated, more theologically fraught. It's the burden of knowing something that could transform millions of souls' experience of purgatory, and yet not being certain how or when to share it in a way that would be received correctly. You see, when Carlo explained to me that evening what he had learned during Eucharistic adoration about the nature of purgatory and especially about how plenary indulgences actually work. He was giving me information that directly challenged the superficial understanding that most Catholics have about this doctrine. And superficial understanding isn't necessarily false understanding. Everything Catholics typically believe about purgatory is technically orthodox. But Carlo showed me that orthodox beliefs can still be pastorally inadequate if they focus only on the punitive dimension of temporal purification, without grasping the profoundly merciful, hopeful, and especially relational dimension of purgatory as a state where souls who died in God's grace are not being punished but healed, not experiencing divine vengeance but divine medicine, not suffering separation but undergoing preparation for the perfect union with God that their souls desire intensely, but for which they are not yet completely ready. The crisis deepened after Carlo's beatification. Suddenly I had a much larger platform. Journalists would ask me, "What did Carlo teach you that you haven't shared publicly?" And I would hesitate, knowing that I possessed this specific teaching about purgatory and indulgences, but uncertain whether the moment was right to share it fully. I would give fragments. I would mention that Carlo had deep insights about the communion of saints and the treasury of merit. But I held back the complete explanation. The 3 specific secrets about plenary indulgences that most priests never explain because they require a level of theological sophistication beyond what is typically taught in basic seminary formation on intermediate eschatology. There were nights when I would lie awake thinking, am I being a coward? Am I failing the mission Carlo gave me? But then I would remember his exact words. When the time is right, especially before the Jubilee that will come in about 20 years, you'll know. And he had been so specific about the timing, about the papal theme of hope, or pilgrims, about the extraordinary opportunity that Jubilee would represent for liberating souls from purgatory, if Catholics understood correctly how to gain plenary indulgences. The internal struggle intensified in 2024, when Pope Francis officially announced the Jubilee year 2026 under the theme, Pilgrims of Hope. The moment I heard that announcement, I felt something shift in my spirit. Carlo's prediction from August 2006 was being fulfilled exactly. A future pope he couldn't have known would convoke a holy year approximately 20 years after our conversation, with a theme directly related to hope, offering expanded opportunities for plenary indulgences, creating the perfect context for the teaching Carlo had asked me to share. But even then, I hesitated. Who was I to teach about indulgences? I'm not a theologian. I'm not a canonist. I'm just a mother who happened to have a son who received extraordinary mystical graces. What if I got the theological nuances wrong? What if I inadvertently led people into scrupulosity or false confidence? What if priests criticized me for overstepping my role as a laywoman? The connection to the supernatural in this story isn't a sudden apparition or a dramatic miracle. It's something more subtle and, in many ways, more profound. It's the reality that my 15-year-old son, 2 months before his death from leukemia, possessed theological insight that went far beyond anything he could have learned from catechism classes, or even from the theological books he read voraciously. I remember exactly how that evening of August 12th, 2006 began. Carlo had been diagnosed with leukemia only 2 weeks earlier, on July 25th. We had started aggressive chemotherapy treatment, and the doctors had been honest with us that the prognosis was very serious. But that particular Saturday evening, Carlo still had relatively good energy and especially extraordinary mental clarity. We were sitting in our living room in Milan. It was approximately 8:30 p.m., late summer evening, still light outside. Andrea was traveling for work. It was just Carlo and me, We had been discussing various spiritual topics when suddenly Carlo shifted the conversation in a way that felt different from our normal discussions about faith. "Mama," he said, and his tone made me put down the book I had been holding. "I need to teach you something very important about purgatory, something God showed me during Eucharistic adoration this week, and something he specifically asked me to explain to you, because you're going to need to share it with others in the future, especially before the Jubilee year that will come in approximately 20 years. I remember my confusion. Jubilee year in 20 years? Carlo had never mentioned anything about future ecclesiastical events before. He nodded seriously. Yes, there will be a special holy year convoked by a future pope. I don't know which pope exactly. Around 2025 or 2026. And that Jubilee year will be an extraordinary opportunity to liberate souls from purgatory through plenary indulgences. But most Catholics will waste that opportunity because they don't understand the secret about how indulgences actually work. I felt something shift in the atmosphere of our living room. This wasn't my teenage son speculating about theology. This was something he had received, something he knew with certainty that came from a source beyond his own reasoning. I had witnessed Carlo's mystical experiences before. His profound encounters during Eucharistic adoration, his intuitive knowledge about people's spiritual states, his understanding of theological truths that seemed to come to him directly rather than through study. But this felt different. This felt like he was being given specific information to transmit, like he was functioning as a messenger. "What secret?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Carlo leaned forward, his dark eyes intense with the urgency of what he needed to communicate. "Let me start with the basics to make sure you understand correctly," he began. And then for the next 40 minutes, he explained to me a teaching about purgatory, plenary indulgences, and the upcoming Jubilee that would transform my understanding of mercy, hope, and the communion of saints. The supernatural dimension of that conversation wasn't just in the content of what Carlo taught me. It was in the way he spoke. He wasn't searching for words or constructing arguments. He was reporting what he had seen, what had been shown to him. Several times during that 40 minutes he would pause and say, "God showed me this analogy," or "This is how our Lord explained it to me," or "The Blessed Mother helped me understand this aspect." He spoke with an authority that didn't come from a 15-year-old's confidence, but from genuine contact with divine truth. In the days immediately following that conversation on August 12th, I found myself experiencing a series of small but significant confirmations that what Carlo had told me was not just theological speculation but genuine revelation. The first confirmation came 3 days later, on August 15th, the Solemnity of the Assumption. I went to Mass at our parish church, and the priest's homily was about the communion of saints, and how Mary's assumption, body and soul, into heaven demonstrates God's power to transform and purify his creatures completely. But then he said something that made me catch my breath. He mentioned that while we celebrate Mary's immediate glorification, we should remember that most souls require purification in purgatory, and that the Church's teaching on indulgences represents God's merciful desire to shorten that purification through the application of Christ's infinite merits. I had heard homilies about purgatory and indulgences before, of course, but this time, with Carlo's detailed explanation fresh in my mind, I heard the priest's words differently. I noticed what he didn't say. He explained that indulgences can be gained by fulfilling certain prescribed works while in a state of grace. But he didn't mention Carlo's 3 secrets, the requirement of being completely free from all attachment to sin, not just free from mortal sin. The optimal moment for gaining a plenary indulgence immediately after sacramental confession. The limit of 1 plenary indulgence per day. After Mass, I approached the priest and asked him about these specific points. He looked at me with kind but slightly confused eyes. Well, yes, technically, a plenary indulgence requires the absence of all attachment to sin, he said. That's in the theological manuals. But we don't usually emphasize that point because it might discourage people from trying to gain indulgences at all. The important thing is that they're in a state of grace and fulfill the prescribed conditions. I realized in that moment exactly what Carlo had meant when he said most priests don't explain the secret. It wasn't that they were teaching heresy. It was that they were offering a simplified version that, while technically orthodox, missed the profound pastoral and spiritual reality of what indulgences actually require and accomplish. The second confirmation came a week later when I was reading one of Carlo's theology books. He had an extensive collection for a 15-year-old. I picked up a book about the Treasury of Merit and the Communion of Saints, a book Carlo had marked extensively, with notes in the margins. On the page discussing plenary indulgences, I found a note in Carlo's handwriting. Most people think they're gaining plenary indulgences, but are actually only gaining partial indulgences because of residual attachments. The Church's mercy is so great that even failed plenary indulgences still have value as partial indulgences. But imagine how many souls could be freed if people understood what truly complete freedom from attachment means. I sat there holding that book, tears streaming down my face, realizing that Carlo had been thinking about this teaching long before our conversation on August 12th. He had been preparing, studying, praying about it. The conversation he had with me wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of months or perhaps years of contemplation and mystical insight. The third confirmation was more subtle but perhaps most powerful. About 10 days after our conversation, I was praying the rosary at Carlo's bedside while he slept, exhausted from chemotherapy. Suddenly, I had an overwhelming sense of presence, not threatening, but profoundly loving, and with that presence came a clear interior understanding. What Carlo told you is true. Guard it carefully, share it at the right time. The Jubilee he spoke of will come exactly as he described, and when it does, this teaching will liberate multitudes. I didn't hear an audible voice. It was more like a certainty implanted directly into my consciousness, accompanied by a peace so deep that all my questions about whether Carlo's teaching was genuine revelation simply dissolved. Carlo died on October 12th, 2006, exactly 2 months after our conversation about purgatory and indulgences. His death was peaceful, surrounded by family, fully conscious until the end, offering his suffering for the Church and for young people. His last coherent words were, "I'm happy to die because I've lived my life without wasting even a minute on things that don't please God." In the weeks and months following his death, I began to experience what I can only describe as a supernatural urgency about the mission he had given me. It wasn't dramatic. No visions, no locutions, no apparitions, but there was a constant gentle pressure in my prayer life, a recurring theme every time I went to Eucharistic adoration or prayed the rosary. Remember what Carlo taught you about the Jubilee. Prepare to share it when the time comes. This urgency intensified during certain specific moments. In 2013, when Pope Francis was elected, I felt a strong interior prompting. This is the Pope who will convoke the Jubilee Carlo spoke about. I had no rational reason to think this. Pope Francis could have called a Jubilee in 2016. in 2020, or not at all during his pontificate. But the interior certainty persisted. Then in 2016, during the Jubilee of Mercy that Pope Francis had indeed convoked, I attended a conference on divine mercy in Rome. One of the speakers was a canonical expert on indulgences who gave a technical presentation about the conditions for gaining plenary indulgences during the Jubilee year. I listened carefully, comparing his explanation to what Carlo had taught me. The canonist was completely orthodox, completely accurate according to official church teaching, but he presented the information in a way that confirmed exactly what Carlo had said. He focused on the external conditions: crossing the holy door, going to confession, receiving communion, praying for the Pope's intentions, without adequately explaining the interior disposition required: complete freedom from all attachment to sin. After his presentation, I approached him privately and asked, "How many Catholics do you think actually gain plenary indulgences during a Jubilee year versus partial indulgences because they still have attachments to venial sin?" He looked at me with surprise, clearly not expecting such a specific theological question from a middle-aged woman. Then he said something I've never forgotten. "Honestly, maybe 5% actually gain the plenary indulgence. Maybe less. The vast majority gain partial indulgences, which are still valuable, but not what they think they're gaining. But we don't emphasize this publicly because we don't want to discourage people from trying. Why not teach them correctly so they could actually succeed?" I asked. He sighed. "Because it requires a level of spiritual maturity that most Catholics simply don't have. To be completely free from all attachment to sin, even venial sin, that's essentially the spiritual state of a saint. We can't expect ordinary Catholics to reach that level." I felt a fire ignite in my chest. But what if the problem isn't that Catholics can't reach that level, but that no one is teaching them how? What if by lowering our expectations we're actually preventing them from experiencing the full mercy God wants to give them? The canonist looked at me thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful thought," he said. "Perhaps you should write about it." Those words stayed with me. Perhaps I should write about it. But not yet. The time wasn't right yet. Carlo had said the Jubilee would come around 2025 or 2026, and it was only 2016. I needed to wait, to prepare, to pray, to ensure that when I did share this teaching publicly, I would do it in a way that was faithful to what Carlo had received and pastorally helpful to the people of God. The supernatural escalation continued through the years following Carlo's beatification in October 2020. Suddenly, I had access to larger platforms, bigger audiences, more influential venues. But every time I was tempted to share the complete teaching about the 3 secrets of plenary indulgences, I would feel an interior check, a sense of not yet. It was frustrating. I had the platform. I had the audience. Why wait? Then in late 2024, when Pope Francis officially announced the Jubilee year 2026 under the theme Pilgrims of Hope, everything clicked into place. The timing Carlo had predicted, approximately 20 years after our conversation. The theme related to hope and pilgrimage, the expanded opportunities for plenary indulgences that Jubilee years always offer. I realized that every delay, every moment of waiting, had been preparation for this exact moment. But there was one final supernatural sign I needed before I felt complete certainty about sharing this publicly. I prayed for months. Lord, if this teaching about the 3 secrets is truly from you, through Carlo, and if this is truly the moment to share it publicly, please give me an unmistakable confirmation. The confirmation came in January 2025, in a way I could never have anticipated. I was invited to speak at a conference in Assisi, the city where Carlo was beatified, on the topic of Blessed Carlo Acutis and youth spirituality. It was a large conference, hundreds of attendees, many bishops and priests, significant media coverage. I had prepared my usual talk about Carlo's love for the Eucharist, his digital evangelization, his devotion to Mary. But the night before the conference, I couldn't sleep. I kept feeling an interior pressure. Tomorrow. Share it tomorrow. The time has come. I argued back in my prayer. But Lord, this is a conference about youth spirituality, not about purgatory and indulgences. The topic doesn't fit. The response I received in my spirit was clear. The topic fits perfectly. Hope is for the young and for the dead. The Jubilee of hope connects both. Speak. I spent most of that sleepless night revising my talk, incorporating the complete teaching Carlo had given me about the 3 secrets of plenary indulgences. I was terrified. What if theologians criticized me? What if I created confusion rather than clarity? What if I was wrong about the timing after all? The next morning, I walked to the podium with my revised notes, my hands shaking. I began with my usual content about Carlo's life, his conversion at age 7, his passion for documenting Eucharistic miracles. But then I shifted. There is something else Carlo taught me, I said. Something I've kept mostly private for 19 years, because I was waiting for the right moment to share it fully. I believe that moment is now, as we prepare for the Jubilee year 2026. The room became very quiet. Everyone knew I had shared extensively about Carlo over the years. The fact that I was saying there was something I had held back captured their complete attention. I took a deep breath and began to share the teaching from our conversation on August 12th, 2006. I explained how Carlo had predicted there would be a Jubilee around 2025 to 2026, with a theme related to hope or pilgrims. I described how he had explained the 3 secrets that invalidate most plenary indulgences: lack of complete freedom from attachment to sin, ignorance of the optimal moment after confession, and misunderstanding of the 1 per day limit. I spoke for about 25 minutes, giving the complete explanation Carlo had given me, including his analogies, his theological precision, his pastoral urgency about ensuring Catholics understood this before the upcoming Jubilee so that millions of souls could potentially be liberated from purgatory. When I finished, the room was silent for several long seconds. Then a bishop in the front row stood up. My heart sank. I thought he was going to challenge me, to question my authority to teach on such technical theological matters. Instead, he said, "Signora Salzano, what you have just shared is completely orthodox, completely aligned with the Church's teaching on indulgences, and desperately needed. I am a bishop. I have taught theology in seminary, and I have never explained plenary indulgences with the clarity and pastoral urgency you just demonstrated. Thank you for sharing your son's gift to the Church." Other voices began to speak up. A priest said, "I've been ordained for 30 years, and I've never understood why so few people seem to benefit from indulgences. Now I understand. We've been teaching the formula without teaching the substance." A theologian said, "This doesn't contradict anything in the Enchiridion of Indulgences or the Catechism. It actually illuminates what those documents say with profound pastoral wisdom." But the confirmation I needed most came from an unexpected source. After the conference ended, an elderly nun approached me. She was tiny, bent with age, but her eyes were bright and clear. She took my hands in hers and said, I am 93 years old. I have been a religious sister for 75 years. I have spent my entire life trying to gain plenary indulgences for the souls in purgatory because I believe deeply in the communion of saints. But I never understood why it felt like I was missing something, why the practice felt more mechanical than transformative. What you shared today has given me the final piece. In whatever time I have left, I will practice what your son taught, going to confession not just to absolve mortal sins, but to purify all attachments, gaining the indulgence immediately afterward while my soul is in its purest state, doing this with complete awareness that I can only truly succeed once per day. Thank you for waiting until the right moment to share this. Thank you for being faithful to your son's mission. I wept as I held that elderly nun's hands, knowing that this was the confirmation I had prayed for. This woman who had devoted her entire life to prayer for the souls in purgatory had just received the teaching that would allow her final years to bear maximum fruit. The Assisi Conference in January 2025 was the breakthrough moment, but the true supernatural climax of this entire story is happening right now, in these months leading up to the Jubilee year 2026. Since that conference, I have received thousands of messages from Catholics around the world who heard my talk or read transcripts of it. But what's extraordinary is the pattern in these messages. They're not just saying, "Thank you for the information." They're reporting transformations in their spiritual lives, and specifically, they're reporting experiences of supernatural confirmation that Carlo's teaching is authentic and powerful. A priest from Brazil wrote to me, "After hearing your talk, I changed how I prepare people for indulgences. I now emphasize confession as purification of attachments, not just forgiveness of mortal sins." Last week, a woman came to confession who had been carrying resentment toward her sister for 15 years. Instead of just absolving her, I helped her understand that resentment is an attachment that would prevent her from gaining a plenary indulgence. We worked through it together. She forgave her sister genuinely, not just formally. Then, immediately after confession, she fulfilled the other conditions for a plenary indulgence for her deceased father. She told me that when she finished praying for the Pope's intentions, she felt her father's presence briefly, but powerfully, and she knew with complete certainty that he had just been released from purgatory. She wept with joy. I wept with her. This is the most profound confession I have heard in my 20 years as a priest. A laywoman from the Philippines wrote, "I am a widow. My husband died 3 years ago. I have been trying to gain plenary indulgences for his soul, but I always felt like something was missing. After learning about the 3 secrets, I realized I had been carrying an attachment to gossip. I would meet with friends and we would talk about other people's problems under the guise of prayer intentions. After your talk, I stopped that practice completely. I went to confession specifically to be purified of that attachment. Immediately after, I gained a plenary indulgence for my husband. That night, I dreamed of him for the first time since his death. In the dream, he was radiant, joyful, and he said to me, 'I am free. Thank you. Live without fear now.' I woke up with a peace I haven't felt since he died. These testimonies have been pouring in daily, but the most profound supernatural confirmation came in March 2025, during a pilgrimage I made to the tomb of Blessed Carlo in Assisi. I was praying there alone, late in the evening after the church had closed to the public. I was thanking God for the response to the teaching about plenary indulgences, and I was asking for wisdom about how to continue sharing this message effectively during the Jubilee year itself. Suddenly I felt Carlo's presence. Not a vision, not an apparition, but that same unmistakable sense of his specific spiritual presence that I've experienced occasionally since his death. And with that presence came a message, not in words but in pure understanding implanted directly into my consciousness. Mama, what I told you in August 2006 was a seed that needed to wait 19 years to grow. Now it will bear fruit beyond what you can imagine. During the Jubilee 2026, if Catholics practice the three secrets faithfully, complete purification from attachments through frequent confession, gaining indulgences immediately after in the moment of greatest purity, understanding the limit of one per day, and making it count, then purgatory will be emptied more dramatically than in any holy year in history. Not because God's mercy is greater now than before, but because His people will finally understand how to receive that mercy fully. This is my final gift to the Church, not another Eucharistic miracle to document, but the key to unlock the treasury of merit that has always been available but rarely accessed correctly. Tell them not to waste this opportunity. Tell them the Jubilee of Hope should result in the liberation of hope, millions of souls freed from purification and entering into the perfect joy of heaven. I remained in prayer for 2 more hours after receiving that message, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Carlo had been shown 19 years ago and what is about to unfold during the Jubilee year. The transformation in my own life since sharing Carlo's teaching publicly has been profound. For 19 years, I carried the weight of a mission I didn't fully understand. I shared extensively about Carlo's devotion to the Eucharist, his work on Eucharistic miracles, his love for Mary, and his cheerful holiness. But there was always this one piece held back, this one crucial teaching that I knew was meant for a specific moment. Now that I've shared it, now that the moment has arrived, I feel a liberation I can barely describe. It's not just relief at finally fulfilling the mission Carlo gave me. It's something deeper, a sense of participating in divine providence in a way that transcends my individual story and connects to the universal Church's preparation for an unprecedented outpouring of mercy. My daily life now includes a new dimension. In addition to my regular work maintaining Carlo's website, collaborating with the canonization cause, and speaking about his life, I've become a teacher of the practice of gaining plenary indulgences correctly. I've worked with theologians and canonists to develop simple but precise materials that explain the 3 secrets in ways that are both theologically accurate and pastorally accessible. I conduct workshops where I walk people through the process. How to examine your conscience, not just for mortal sins, but for attachments to venial sins. How to bring those attachments specifically to confession. How to receive absolution with the intention of being completely freed from all disordered affections. How to immediately fulfill the other conditions, communion, prayer for the Pope's intentions, the prescribed work, while your soul is in that moment of maximum purity after confession. How to understand that you can only truly succeed in gaining 1 plenary indulgence per day. So make it count. Make it intentional. Make it a genuine act of love for a specific soul in purgatory. The feedback has been transformative not just for others but for me. I've received letters from people who say, "I've been Catholic my whole life, and I never understood that indulgences were real, powerful, effective, until you explained what your son taught you." Others write, "I thought indulgences were medieval superstition, but now I understand they're the ultimate expression of the communion of saints and God's merciful desire to unite us all in perfect charity." But perhaps the most profound transformation is in my relationship with Carlo himself. For years after his death, I related to him primarily as my deceased son, someone I had lost and grieved and missed. After his beatification, I related to him also as Blessed Carlo, an intercessor, someone whose prayers could help others. But now, through this mission he gave me, I relate to him as a prophet whose vision extended far beyond his 15 years of earthly life, and whose final gift to the Church is unfolding exactly as he predicted. Here we are in 2025, on the threshold of the Jubilee year 2026 that Pope Francis has convoked under the theme, Pilgrims of Hope. Every detail is exactly as Carlo described 19 years ago during that conversation on August 12, 2006. A future pope he couldn't have known, a theme related to hope and pilgrimage, an extraordinary opportunity for plenary indulgences, and most importantly, a moment in history when the Church desperately needs to recover the fullness of its teaching on the communion of saints and the treasury of merit. Carlo's teaching about the 3 secrets, complete freedom from attachment to sin, the optimal moment immediately after confession, and the limit of 1 plenary indulgence per day, is not complicated, but it requires something most Catholics have never been taught: that God's mercy is so abundant, so generous, so eager to purify and perfect us, that we can literally participate in the liberation of souls from purgatory through practices that are completely within our reach if we understand them correctly and practice them faithfully. During the Jubilee year 2026, there will be countless opportunities to gain plenary indulgences, crossing the Holy Door in Rome or in diocesan cathedrals, participating in missions of mercy, making pilgrimages to designated churches, performing works of charity under specific conditions. The Church will offer these opportunities generously because God's mercy is infinite, and His desire to unite all His children in perfect charity is unwavering. But those opportunities will only bear the fruit they're meant to bear if Catholics understand what I've shared with you today. If we approach indulgences as mere formulas to be completed mechanically, we'll gain partial indulgences at best. If we approach them as Carlo taught, as opportunities for profound interior purification, combined with the application of Christ's infinite merits to souls who are being prepared for perfect union with God, then we will witness what Carlo saw in his mystical insight: purgatory being emptied more dramatically than in any previous holy year. This isn't about earning salvation through our works. Salvation is pure gift, pure grace, through Christ's death and resurrection. But the doctrine of indulgences, properly understood, is about how completely God desires to purify us and our loved ones, how eager He is to apply the infinite merits of Christ to shorten or eliminate the temporal purification required for souls who are already destined for heaven. If you're listening to this story today, it's not by accident. Carlo believed deeply that nothing happens by coincidence, that every moment is orchestrated by divine providence for purposes of love. You're hearing this teaching now because you're meant to participate in this mission. Whether you're a priest who can teach this to your parishioners, a layperson who can share it with your family, a theologian who can write about it with scholarly precision, or simply a Catholic who will practice it faithfully during the Jubilee year, you have a role to play. My son Carlo told me the secret that most priests never explain, that plenary indulgences truly can empty purgatory if Catholics understand 3 things: complete purification from attachments through confession, gaining indulgences immediately after while the soul is purest, and making the one daily opportunity count through intentionality and love. He told me there would be a Jubilee around 2026 that would be the greatest opportunity for liberation of souls in decades. That Jubilee is here. The opportunity is now. Don't waste it through ignorance or superficial practice. Learn the 3 secrets. practice them faithfully, and participate in the revolutions of mercy that God is offering to the Church and to the world through the Jubilee year 2026, the Jubilee of hope that will liberate not just those who cross holy doors as pilgrims, but countless souls who await in purgatory for someone to understand and apply correctly the infinite treasury of Christ's merits on their behalf. This is Carlo's final documented miracle, not a Eucharistic miracle captured in a digital database, but a living miracle of mercy that will unfold soul by soul, confession by confession, indulgence by indulgence, throughout the Jubilee year, liberating multitudes into the perfect joy of heaven. May God grant all of us the grace to understand what Carlo understood, to practice what he practiced, and to participate in the great work of mercy that is about to unfold during the Jubilee year 2026, the year of pilgrims of hope, when hope will be liberated from purgatory and will enter into the endless light of God's perfect love. Amen.